My name is Russell Swanson, and this is the 6th lecture in a 20-part lecture series I'm offering on the history of ethics. And today I'm going to be talking to you about one of the absolute giants of the Western philosophical tradition. And I'm talking about Aristotle, the greatest student of Plato. And I'm going to be pulling ideas mostly from Aristotle's great work on ethics called the Nicomachean Ethics, or the Nicomachean Ethics, however you'd like to pronounce that. Before I dive into some of the ideas that Aristotle develops on having the best of existence, I'd like to give you just a little bit of background on Aristotle. It's a little difficult to overstate in some ways, I think, the intellectual legacy of Aristotle. He's one of the most influential thinkers in the history of Western civilization and arguably the world in terms of his impact. He defines many different areas of thought, literally sort of writes the first ever entire books on many areas of thought, including ethics. His Nicomachean Ethics is the first ever book, as far as we know, written on nothing but the ethical question of how to get the most out of existence or how to have a good life. Of course, Plato's the first major writer that we know of in the Western tradition, but Aristotle takes this to another level in terms of specialization of knowledge, and as I've said, just sort of lays out a number of different fields of thought, and then for centuries, if not almost millennia, 1,500 years or so, will off again, on again, be the dominant thinker in terms of influence in the Western tradition. So, one thing that's maybe relevant here I'll share with you is it's reported that Charles Darwin, who was a pretty influential thinker in his own right, said that Aristotle was probably the greatest biologist of history. Now, that's kind of a particularly good compliment when you consider that when Aristotle was alive, biology was not yet a field. But I think what Darwin's saying, talking in the 19th century, is that Aristotle, in a number of different fields, including the study of living organisms in the natural world, just lays so much of the foundation out that everybody in some sense sort of standing upon the shoulders of Aristotle. And he's going to figure into the story of ethics in some very interesting ways. And I'll try to develop those for you here. And then again later, when he's really influential in what would be called the late Middle Ages in Western civilization. And yet, in some of the ways, there'll be this incredible irony to his legacy, because while he'll be the one to lay the foundations of the study of the natural world in many respects in the West, that same sort of study of the natural world will come back and in some ways undercut the theory of reality, the metaphysics that Aristotle offers, and that in and of itself will have some huge implications in the field of ethics, because I've tried to argue to you guys, and I'll repeat this theme for you, that as we mature and become more nuanced in our thinking about a good life, we tend to find it important to ground our notion of a good life down into our metaphysics, our theory of life. Again, I just want to talk a little bit more about how influential Aristotle is. There's a painting that I'd like to draw your attention to, and that is the School of Athens by Raphael. Raphael is an early, Renaissance painter who was commissioned to do a fresco on the wall of the Pope's library in the Apostolic Palace at the Vatican. And I think it's just a little bit interesting to think about that on the wall of the Pope's library, you have this painting, which I encourage you to look at, of some dozens of pagan, non-Christian thinkers, particularly from the Greek and Hellenistic era. And in some sense, I interpret that as the Christian theological tradition recognizes in some ways the debt that it has to these pre-Christian thinkers. And that's perhaps more significant than many of you might imagine. So I'll try to unpack that also as we move forward in this lecture series. But right in the center of this painting, when you look at it, there's two figures. And one's a slightly older man who's holding a book. I believe it's Republic, actually, if you look carefully enough. And that slightly older man with this long gray beard is Plato. And Plato is making a gesture like this. And next to him is a bearded man who's obviously a little younger, and perhaps, oh, it might not be Republic that Plato's holding. It might be a different, like Timaeus or something like that, a later dialogue. But next to him is this younger man that is Aristotle. And Aristotle, I should have looked this up before my lecture, but maybe holding the Nicomachean Ethics. And Aristotle is making a gesture in contrast to Plato's gesture. Plato's pointing up, and Aristotle is making a gesture sort of like this. And it's as if, in some sense, he's pointing down, or he's trying to ground discourse. And it's a brilliant move on the part of Raphael, because in such a simple way, he's captured one of the fundamental arguments in philosophy itself. If you've been following this lecture series, right, you'll know that, Plato, what's Plato pointing at when he's pointing up? Well, he's pointing at, in some ways, you might say, the sun, or he's pointing at the ultimate light. He's pointing at a good. And in some sense, this is a good which I'll say transcends the physical world, right? And so Plato is pointing up at a transcendent, non-physical ultimate good that is kind of a finish line, highest level of experience or attainment in a human life. And here is Aristotle, and I'll develop the case for this a little bit more, with this other gesture saying, in some sense, no, teacher, I love you, you're dear to me, right? But life is found here. There is no transcendent good beyond the physical world. The good of existence is found here in what I will overly simply call the natural world for Aristotle. And so that actually sets up, a debate that in some ways is, one of the fundamental debates about what makes life worth living. Is it some transcendent good that is somehow beyond the physical world? I think you'll find that Platonic philosophy and what's often called Neoplatonic philosophy in the Hellenistic era is actually going to have a pretty significant impact on early Christian theology. And in some ways, if you've listened to my lecture on the allegory of the cave, you should recognize that structure that's going to be echoed in the writings of somebody like Augustine of Hippo, who's going to be an early important Christian theologian, trained himself as a philosopher, a teacher of philosophy, converting to Christianity as an adult, and then trying to develop a kind of a picture of the Christian worldview. In some ways is clearly pulling from the allegory to talk about a less physical, cultural and physical realm, and a less important cultural and physical realm, and a more important non-physical, dare I say again, spiritual realm that transcends the physical realm. And that I think shows up in particular in Augustine's work, City of God, as he contrasts the city of man, which is that which is passes, and that which is part of the flow of existence, and it's not permanent, it's not stable, versus the city of God, which transcends the physical realm, the city of the soul, and where the soul alone can inhabit. Now, the path, again, for the Christian theologian is not going to be the intellectual path that Plato had laid out, and it's not going to be a virtue theory in terms of how do you get the most out of this existence. It'll be a kind of a modified virtue theory that talks about how do you deserve the next existence, the more real, more important return to the beatific vision of the source of all creation. And again, I hope you can hear, if you listen to my lecture on the allegory of the cave, you can hear these parallels. But that's the Platonic picture, right? And what Raphael captures so beautifully, right there in the center of this painting in the School of Athens, right, is that Aristotle the most famous and influential student of Plato, who in many ways, in terms of influence, I would say eclipses Plato, is saying, no, it's not about a transcendent good. It's not about something beyond the physical world. It's something that's very much of the natural world. And so, that debate in some ways continues to this day for people, right? And this is yet another way in which your theory of reality and your metaphysics really informs your ethical theory, your notions of what is a good life and what makes life really worthwhile. Okay, so Aristotle, right, let's call him Mr. Down to Earth, right, Mr. Natural World, comes into the picture by showing up at the academy around the age of 17 or 18. Now, let me give you just a little bit of background on Aristotle. He was in many ways a fortunate son. He was born to a family that was successful and influential. In particular, his father, we think, was a physician, and maybe even a physician to a king in kind of a northern part of what we think of as the Greek peninsula, and I think up in the northeast part of what we would think of as around Greece these days. And so Aristotle is a highly educated, wealthy young man. I think his father, though, will die fairly early in life. And so he will go off as a part of, in some ways, that first generation of human beings, right, that have not just a trade school to go to, right, which, again, that's a powerful opportunity to be able to go to a trade school and learn a skill that would allow you to make a living. Aristotle's going to have this sort of fortunate background and this fortunate moment in history that's going to allow him to go off to the first ever academy, right? The Platonic Academy, which is by this time, it's become an accumulation of, in some ways, the top creative and philosophical minds of the Mediterranean, and it's led by this giant of an intellectual, Plato. And Aristotle will spend we think, 20 years until the death of Plato. So maybe Aristotle shows up around, I don't know, 367 or something like that at the academy. It's about halfway through Plato's career at the academy. Plato would have really matured as a thinker by this. It's about 20 years in his time at the academy, having created it 20 years prior. And then Aristotle will spend the next 2 decades in kind of direct debate with the giant that is Plato. And let's underline this point just a little bit, because I'm contributing in some indirect ways that I don't intend, so I want to kind of correct this, to this overemphasis upon individual intellects in terms of the way thought develops. It's never that simple. And in some sense, I want to give the nod to that right now by just saying, look, even Aristotle, who I think is very deserving in many ways of our attention and our recognition as I've said, maybe one of the most influential intellectuals in history, right? And thinkers in history. At the same time, he doesn't do it alone, right? I mean, he gets a fantastic education as growing up. He's got this sort of orientation to the world that his father, the doctor, gives him. And then he's got 20 years. I mean, we should take pride in a 2-year degree or a 4-year degree or a extended graduate school degree. Imagine 20 years of thinking at the academy with somebody like Plato. It's really kind of a rare moment in intellectual history. Most of the big influential intellectuals and thinkers of history that influence each other directly, they do so by virtue of their writing. Occasionally they meet and interact, right? Famously there's, let's say like Freud and Jung in the history of psychology in the 20th century. Or maybe Kant and Hume in the 18th century, but just via writing. But think about it, Plato standing on the shoulders of Socrates, right? Personal, direct relationship for years. And then Aristotle standing on the shoulders of Plato. And in some ways, this, this trifecta, this trinity of thinkers, right? Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, they're going to launch philosophy, right? With this philia sophia, right? This relationship, this love between peers, this community of seekers after wisdom is what's going to, I think, allow them to see so far and influence so much. And so be careful, in this lecture series, I'm emphasizing the ideas of particular individuals, but I want to be clear about something. I don't think it's ever that simple. It's always a community that behind the individual. It's always a set of relationships behind, a set of opportunities and relationships behind these individuals. And so in some sense, we use these individuals as symbols of a set of ideas as much as they are sort of the historical cause of these ideas. With that said, let me just take one more second for a tangent and just emphasize that in this lecture series on the history of ethics, not only are we going to talk about individuals, we're going to talk a lot about a bunch of what I will call dead white men. And that is not in some ways an accident, right? It is in some ways very much the result of the cultures out of which these influential thinkers emerge, being very sexist cultures, cultures that were ethnocentric, and cultures which allowed opportunities to people with money that people without money didn't have. And I just want to sort of draw conscious attention to that too, because the way in which I might do this kind of classical unfolding of the history of ethics in Western civilization by looking at some of these giants and in terms of influential thinkers, keep in mind that there's a community and a set of opportunities behind every one of these individuals. And then there's also a kind of a filter in place that is the explanation as to why we tend to be, for so much of the tradition, just talking about men of certain ethnicities, and largely talking about men that have, certain economic opportunities. And that will change in the modern era, in the late modern era, I would say, almost what we might think of as the postmodern era in some respects. It'll really start to change in the 19th and 20th century. And let's just, use one little factoid for this. In the United States of America, which in many ways represents a kind of in the big picture of history, right? The United States as a democracy with its constitution still in place for such a long period of time represents an interesting kind of front edge of an experiment of a way to have a community and a society. And when do people of color get included? You could make the case that it's late 20th century. We'll amend the Constitution to include men of color, at least in terms of, in theory. That will be held back by what I think are generations of Jim Crow laws in the United States. But you get right after, the Civil War, so late 19th century, some 50 years after we amend the Constitution to allow men of color, in theory, in word, I would say only, the right to participate in, let's say, our political institutions and our debates and in our, our educational systems. Of course, again, I think that's largely just on paper for another 100 years. But it's 50 years prior to when we allow women the right to participate in our political structures, and then even after that, right, it'll be a long time before women are really genuinely encouraged to participate in our educational structures. And so let's just make note here that we're talking about, an important kind of intellectual legacy here. And in this moment, I'm developing the case for how, Raphael, another talented man, paints a painting that represents, the way in which other talented men, Plato and Aristotle, shape, I would argue, the ideas for centuries in Western civilization, and in some ways to this day set up the debates that you and I should be considering. Let's just go ahead and underline that there is, I think, a good way to understand the sort of narrowness of the subset of humanity participating meaningfully in the discourse about a good life, and that will change eventually when we get to the late modern era. But for now, that's why I'm going to continue to talk about these ideas of a bunch of dead white men. It's not because I have some, as a man who self-identifies as, I don't know, kind of pinkish brown, but on the forms I fill it out as me self-identify as Caucasian, and I have had educational opportunities, and I'm standing on the shoulders of giants in many ways in terms of relationships and opportunities as well. But this isn't me privileging yet again men and people with money and people of certain ethnicities. So I just want to sort of call that out about intellectual history, that we should take a more critical look at that, and we should try to understand that that's the case, and that as impressive as these thinkers were, in some sense, we have through sexism and I would say racism or ethnocentrism, and through classism, we have really limited discourse about a good life for millennia. But we will finally see that blossom out in the 19th and especially in the 20th century and to this day, right? If you look around you in society today, I think you're going to see something that looks a lot more diverse. And, let's go ahead and underline in a history of ethics kind of lecture series, that this represents what is moral progress, right? And this is, let's be clear, because this has become so kind of over politicized and polarized, this is not a knock on white men. This is just a sort of a factual description of cultural history. And so it's going to be eventually a good thing, right? That women and people of different ethnicities and people of a range of different economic backgrounds get to cultivate the relationships and get to take advantage of the opportunities that will allow them to inform discourse in the 20th and now 21st century going forward. I think that represents ethical and moral progress, and it enriches our discourse about a good life. Okay, so with that tangent taken, let's return our story to this disagreement between Plato and his greatest student Aristotle. Aristotle's going to show up at the Platonic Academy at 17 or 18 and be there 20 some odd years until Plato dies. And then when Plato dies, there's going to be this big debate about how to carry on the institution that is the academy, some 40 years old now, has a bit of a tradition going. And in the debates that ensue upon the death of Plato, one thing that's going to happen is that there's going to be this, what I kind of half-jokingly refer to, one of the worst hiring decisions of history. You could have asked Aristotle to run your educational philosophical institution, and instead you're going to ask Speusippus to run it. Now, Speusippus, I'm sure, was a very smart guy, and I'm kind of dissing him here without knowing a lot about him, so I'm doing this, I hope, in a charitable spirit to sort of make a joke, but also to make a deeper underlying point here that's not personal against Speusippus, and that is that Speusippus was, it would seem, he's a family member of Plato's. I think he's a nephew of Plato's. He's Athenian, right? He shares the same ethnicity as Plato. There may have been some maybe property rights and property law implications of who should run the academy, maybe. He's Plato's nephew. He's Athenian. The Athenians were very proud and ethnocentric people. And Speusippus, it would seem, was primarily a mathematician. That was crucial to Plato. Supposedly, there's this sort of motto that maybe is carved into the entrance at the academy, that let none but geometers enter here. Let no one who's not trained in mathematics come to this intellectual community. And so the nephew that is Athenian, that is loyal to the teachings of Plato, will take over instead of Aristotle. Aristotle, by this time, the time of Plato's death, it will be obvious that, Aristotle's not a relative of Plato's. He's not from Athens, and he's got major philosophical disagreements with Plato. But at the same time, it also is probably obvious, I imagine, to all there, that Aristotle is the giant. It may be apocryphal, but there's a story that Plato said that there was a student body at the academy and that the head of the student body was Aristotle. Whether it's true or not, it's probably a fair recognition that Aristotle was an incredibly capable and hardworking and dedicated philosophical thinker who was in many ways kind of challenging, the great master Plato at his own school. And maybe for those reasons, and maybe some even uglier reasons, right, along with nepotism and ethnocentrism and intellectual loyalty, we see that Aristotle is not offered the leadership of the academy when Plato dies. And I like to sort of foreground that and speculate openly about that with you for a moment. Again, we don't know for sure that that's the reasoning why Aristotle isn't chosen as the leader, but I want to recognize that it's very possible at this incredible institution, which I have said is such an kind of important sort of moment of history symbolically, that we develop this whole notion of academia, the walls within which you are to think deeply about life so that you deserve more of a say in society and can think for yourself about existence. At even such a noble institution, it's possible that we're seeing very, very human psychological and emotional biases informing a major, major decision like who will be the first ever leader after Plato is gone. And so, philosophers, we're not immune, right, to that. We're trying as thinkers to develop our frontal lobe in important ways, but of course it's, as I argued in my first lecture in this series, that the neocortex of the human being is built upon the mammalian cortex, is built upon this old structure, the old brain, the reptilian fish brain structure. It's all in there, right? And it's all part of who we are. And we should never forget that and sort of pretend that we're more than we are. Again, championing the amazing accomplishments of these figures and of the amazing potential of what we can all do as human beings and as Homo sapiens. But remember, as I said in my opening lecture in this series, the name that we've given ourselves, Homo sapiens sapiens, if we understand that as wise human creature, is as much aspirational as it is descriptive. We have to earn that in some sense through our hard work and our effort to cultivate relationships and take advantage of opportunities and stand on the shoulders of giants in order to develop our own more thoughtful philosophies of existence, and ultimately just make this connection, maybe make the experiment of democracy itself, excuse me, all that more interesting and perhaps productive. And so, Aristotle doesn't get chosen for leadership here. I want to give you just a little bit more of his biography to set up his thinking in the Nicomachean Ethics, or the Nicomachean Ethics. It would seem that Aristotle eventually will end up back home. He's got some connections to the court back home. His father may have been physician to the king, and Aristotle would have a personal connection with the prince who's now become king. And I'm talking here about King Philip of Macedon or Macedonia. And so when Aristotle ends up back in the court of Philip, he's going to find a job, not a bad job. Philip's going to ask him to tutor his son. His son's name's Alexander, and Aristotle will be the private tutor of a young guy named Alexander. And you probably recognize where that's going. That guy's going to become Alexander the Great, and he's going to conquer much of the known world by the age of 30. Once his father is assassinated, once Philip is assassinated, Alexander will go on to sort of try to fulfill his father's vision of the first ever kind of pan-Hellenic, pan-Greek empire. While Athens had dominated in its golden age, you know, it was still sort of dominant over just Attica, right? A portion of the Greek peninsula, and was eventually conquered by the Peloponnesian forces, especially Sparta. The Macedonians under Alexander will achieve what no Greek city-state ever had, and that is the conquering of the entire peninsula of Greece, what we call Greece, and then turning east and conquering mighty Persia. And so that's the guy that Aristotle tutors for a couple of years, one-on-one. That would be pretty cool to have somebody like Aristotle be your private tutor for a couple of years. And I don't want to overstate the influence of Aristotle, but that'd be pretty intellectually stimulating to have Aristotle as your private tutor for years. And then importantly, Alexander is going to go on to sort of take over the known world in the West, as you know, from the Mediterranean all the way over to almost as far as we think of India, and conquering all of the Persian Empire and sort of establishing a new capital of the Macedonian Empire in what's called this Hellenic age in Mesopotamia. Unfortunately, Alexander will die. Well, I say unfortunately, a tragedy. He dies very young. We think early 30s. But before he does, right, in that 10 or 12 years that he'd been conquering the known world, Aristotle is going to get the opportunity to return to Athens now with this connection to the Macedonian court, and he'll establish his own school in direct, in some ways, competition with the Platonic Academy. And so the second of the four great schools will be created by Aristotle, the first being the Academy and the second being the Lyceum. And the focus at the Lyceum will be more empirical, I might say, more sort of observational and sense-based than the mathematical focus on abstraction at the Platonic Academy, as influenced by the legacy of Plato, who, remember, was advocating that we get out of the cave, that we go beyond the physical realm to the non-physical realm of pure abstractions. What Aristotle's going to say, Mr. Down to Earth, right, is that what we need to do is use our observational abilities and then think about our observations in order to understand what Aristotle will call the natural world. And so the metaphysics of Plato is dualistic, right? Physical and cultural world, and then non-physical world of forms. And the good life is about aiming at the world of forms with your mind, and maybe ultimately the ultimate good, the form of all the forms, getting to the ultimate enlightenment. For Aristotle, you know, I've called sort of Mr. Down to Earth, right, is in some ways going to say, look, you need to observe and gather data about the natural world, and then you can understand the patterns, but the patterns are never separate from. There's no other level of reality for us to get to. We need to find the best of human life in this natural world. And so that is the Aristotelian metaphysics that's referred to as naturalism. There's sort of one level of reality, the natural world is it, we observe it and we think about it. And if we observe it and think about it well enough, we can achieve, in some sense, our greatest good within this natural context. And that's going to be, again, that's going to really shape Aristotle's ethics, of course, because metaphysics for these sophisticated debate going forward between transcendent levels of reality tied to transcendent notions of good that will really inform particularly Christian theology going forward. When Greek philosophy, you know, sort of on the front end of the medieval period, on the back end of the medieval period, really influences the two giants of Christian theology, Augustine and Aquinas. But we'll also see, right, the long legacy that will be left by Aristotle that will be very influential among Islamic scholars in the Islamic Empire. And then eventually, when it's pulled back into Western civilization in the late Middle Ages, that naturalism is going to be part of what rekindles the study of the natural world. That'll be a part of the rebirth of the Greek philosophical experiment, the rebirth of the ancient age, and the blossoming of the Enlightenment into what we think of as the modern age in Western civilization. Again, a little foreshadowing there of where we'll go later on in the lecture series. So what I want to do now is I want to start to dig in on some of the major ideas about a good life within the natural world that are laid out in the famous work, the Nicomachean Ethics, or I like to pronounce it the Nicomachean Ethics of Aristotle. I want to start off exploring the ideas of this work by sort of characterizing what I think is the main project of this work. Probably a work written around 320s before zero. It's a work which seems to focus on the question of what is the purpose of human existence. What is the telos, to use the Greek word, the purpose, the aim, the goal of human existence. This actually is going to be a really important concept, not only for understanding the concept of the purpose, the concept of the telos is going to be really important for understanding Aristotelian thought. It's going to be really important for understanding the Aristotelian legacy, particularly in one very important expression of that legacy in Christian thought in the late Middle Ages as it influences Thomas Aquinas, major, maybe the most significant in terms of influence, Christian theologian, particularly, certainly in the Catholic Christian tradition. And that is going to be tied to what we're going to call the natural law theory of morality, which has its own legacy in and through the modern era. So we need to make sure that we're, and I'm hoping this is one of my goals for you if you're following this lecture series, is that while each lecture is sort of designed to stand on its own, they're very much designed to sort of build on each other. And if you do allow them to build on each other, what they'll offer you is perhaps a way of understanding the development of thought through time that gives you a deeper context for understanding ethical debate in the 20th and 21st century. And that's ultimately my goal in generating this lecture series, right, is to offer you the opportunity to become more sophisticated philosophical thinkers, examining your own innermost assumptions about what it means to live a good life and how can you be a good person by standing on the shoulders of the giants of history and more deeply understanding the context within which you live in a moment of history that is very much informed by a lot of this history. And Aristotle certainly a giant here in many ways. And so I've started off an exploration of the Nicomachean Ethics by saying that Aristotle in this work is primarily concerned with the question of what is the purpose of human existence. Now, that question, is in some ways kind of the juicy philosophical question that maybe we think of when we think of philosophy itself, like what is the purpose of life, right? Okay, let's be clear here about a couple things. One, this is more specific than what is the purpose of existence. It's also less specific and more abstract than the very 21st century question that your minds are likely to go towards, which is what is the purpose of my existence? I'm going to argue in this lecture series that you've been shaped by a lens that is highly, highly influenced by what we call individualism. And this is influences your metaphysical conceptions, and it certainly influences your ethical and political philosophical conceptions. And for this reason, right now, when I ask the question, that I'm arguing is central in the Nicomachean Ethics, and that is that what is the purpose of human life? My guess is that some of your minds are going to go immediately to the question of, yes, good question, I need to find my purpose. Look, I'm not trying to argue that you finding your purpose is not interesting. We'll talk about that later in the course, although we need to dig in a little bit more on this idea of purpose itself, and maybe show why we were going to be a little suspicious of that concept. But the question of why my individual life or your individual life is interesting, and what is your individual path? That's a cool question, an important question in many respects, but it's not Aristotle's question. Remember that Aristotle, the naturalist, right, is in some ways setting the stage for biology later. So he's asking the question really about the species. And the logic behind this seems to be that, look, of course, Aristotle can't tell, you, Bob, how to be Bob, or you, Mary, how to be, Mary. Can't tell Alexandria how to be Alexandria. He doesn't know you, right? And even if he did, he can't, he's not going to dedicate his life trying to be an expert on just you as an individual. This is a guy who's trying to develop more powerful knowledge by cultivating what, if there is any possible, a wisdom about being the kind of creature we are. And so the question of what is the purpose of human life very much focuses on what is the purpose of the species in some sense, the kind of creature we are as what we've called Homo sapiens. With that said, that question is both compelling to some minds and problematic to others. And I would say problematic to those in particular who studied enough evolutionary biology. Let me ask kind of a question that foreshadows some work we'll do later in the lecture series. What do you think was the purpose of Tyrannosaurus Rex? Or I might ask more abstractly, a little bit more fun question. What was the purpose of the dinosaurs in general, these large reptiles? Why were they here? And in some sense, it's a rhetorical question that I'm asking, not because the answer is obvious, but because I'm asking because the answer is problematic. It's not at all clear from certainly a 21st century naturalistic perspective, that which is going to be sort of the continuation of Aristotle's systematic study of the natural world. It's not at all clear that there is some kind of preordained purpose, right? In fact, I would argue that most evolutionary biologists are going to lean strongly away from this concept, and that'll be one of the ironic parts of the Aristotelian legacy. But for the moment, let me go recognize that to his credit, even Aristotle, right, tries to not just assert the value of the question that is central to the project of the Nicomachean Ethics. He's not just going to assert the value of the question of what is the purpose of human life. He is, as a very methodical person, going to try to reason his readers / listeners to this valuation of the question itself. And so he's got kind of two lines of thought that he offers within the Nicomachean Ethics that help support why we would put a lot of effort and time into the question of what is the purpose or the telos of a good human life. One very generally is that his metaphysics are, while we have described them so far as naturalistic, they are also teleological, sort of famously teleological. And here's what I mean by that. Aristotle had a conception of the universe, that is, we say teleological, that is, as sort of telos-filled and telos-informed, that Aristotle would have seen the world in many ways as a world that was designed in some ways by a kind of an intelligence, a kind of a perfection that would give everything that is a reason to be. Now, again, you should recognize, the way in which that's playing out, even in contemporary cultural debates, in the form of what we might think of as intelligent design arguments, for better or worse. I would argue for the worse, but I want to be charitable here and just underlying the way in which Aristotle continues in many ways to really, be a symbol of something that is culturally, in terms of the lens of the beliefs and the debates within culture in the modern world, continues to sort of play out as a player, as a factor. And here, this teleological conception of reality. I'll try to develop it in a way that's as charitable to Aristotle as I can. Remember that while Darwin will praise Aristotle as the most sort of important biologist of history, this will be, about 2,000 years before, we get kind of a really advanced theory of the mechanisms by which evolution takes place within the biological level of reality. And so Aristotle would have been working with a much narrower data set in terms of the snapshot of the natural world that he was observing. And while he was an incredible observer of the natural world and an important early sort of taxonomer and systematic thinker about the natural world, and this is, I think, part of what Darwin is praising about Aristotle, he's also got such a limited data set at his point in history in terms of a fossil record that he's going to fall into a trap that I would argue Plato himself also falls into, and that is sort of seeing reality as a sort of a stable structure. And so in some sense, because he comes so long before, not the idea of evolution, which is actually an ancient Greek idea that is itself reborn and expanded in the modern age, he doesn't come before the idea of evolution itself, but he comes so long before a really coherent and defensible account of evolutionary biology that he sees reality as a kind of a, not quite static, but more stable set of natural structures. And if you look at particular, let's say like ecosystems with the framework that they are sort of timeless ecological or naturalistic structures, what you're going to see, especially in old ecosystems, and is, pretty complexly interrelated relationships in which there does seem to be a kind of a food web in place and a bunch of relationships in place that's going to strongly suggest this kind of teleological conception in which it looks like when you look at, say, the role of a particular kind of plant or animal in the, let's say, pollinating other, pollinating that plant, and then, in many respects, like allowing other creatures to live because that plant gets pollinated successfully, you're going to start to see that, in some sense, it's true. If you pull something out of a food web that's developed over a long period of time and is fairly homeostatic, you can really mess with the structure by pulling one thing out of place, like a pollinator. And that's going to be very suggestive, I think. This is me being very charitable, right, to Aristotle's work from 2,300 years ago. And I think that in some respects, he's going to look at the natural world and reach this conclusion that everything has a purpose. And that if everything has a purpose, even though we don't understand it, right, he doesn't have the book of life. He's not pretending to have some kind of revelatory understanding of all the secrets of why things are what they are. Aristotle's, a confident and in many ways arrogant thinker, but on the other hand, he's got enough sort of self-awareness to realize that as a human being, all we've got is observation and reasoning to try to unlock as best we can an understanding of the structures of the natural world and ourselves. And the framework to him looks teleological. And if the framework of nature is teleological, purpose-filled, well then, humans, which are a part of and reality, must have a purpose as well. Hence the question of the Nicomachean Ethics that, asking the question of what is the purpose of existence. And again, let's also be clear here about the connection to ancient ethics and the question of how to live a good life. Think of it this way. Imagine you got hired to do a job by a friend and you took the job because it was, just very convenient hours and great pay, but you didn't know a lot about the job yet, but you just trusted your friend. And then all of a sudden on day one, your friend says, look, we're going to evaluate you in a month. So, good luck. You should have a moment of panic right there because this great new convenient, good paying job is going to have an evaluation in a month, then you haven't heard a lot yet about what you're supposed to do here. What's your goal? What's your purpose? How can you ensure the likelihood of a successful evaluation in a month if you don't even know your purpose? Okay, do you see the analogy I'm building here? How can we as human beings evaluate human life as successful if we don't understand our purpose in being alive? That to me seems to be the logic behind the question of the Nicomachean Ethics. But I also want to add, I said there's two lines of thought here that he offers us to argue for the importance of the question. And I want to add a second line of reasoning that's often referred to as the argument against infinite regress. It really just is a very small passage in the text where Aristotle, almost with, I believe, a rhetorical question, sort of asks, if we could inquire more deeply and more deeply and more deeply and more deeply into our motivation, perhaps with a kind of a childlike question of why? If that line of questioning could go on forever, Aristotle says there would be an infinite regress, a kind of an infinite chain of answers going backwards, deeper into human motivation. And he recognizes logically, well, that's a problem, because if you never get to kind of a final answer, underline that word final, we'll come back to it. If you never get to a greatest answer to this question of what is the sort of ultimate purpose of human existence, then in some sense, you really don't have a foundation for all the other answers. I often do in my ground classes a kind of an experiment with my students, and it almost always turns out the same way. So I'll give you an example of how it usually sort of unpacks. I'll ask some, poor sucker, volunteer, a question of why they got out of bed this morning. And, a lot of times, especially if it's a morning class, the person will say, well, I got out of bed to come to class. I say, okay, fine. Why did you come to class? I'm going to hit them with the why. And, well, why did you come to class? Well, they say something, clever, like, I'm not trying to fail this class. I'm trying, they want, okay, all right. Well, why are you trying to pass this class? Well, I'm trying to get my degree. Okay. And, well, why are you trying to get your degree? Well, I'm trying to get a job. Well, why are you trying to get a job? Well, I'm trying to, establish some economic security. Well, why are you trying to establish some economic security? Well, I want to have certain kinds of experiences that might involve, relationships or family. It might not, but I want to be able to, not live month to month. And so the financial security of a good paying job will allow me to have certain kinds of experiences and maybe like literally some stuff. And then I say, okay, cool, good vision, fair enough. Kind of standard, right? The way it plays out in our cultural vision of life. So why do you want some stuff and why do you want some experiences? And this is the point in which the why is starting to get a little annoying for the poor volunteer, and the rest of the class starts to giggle at this poor person, and maybe we even start to need some help. Another class, because why do you want stuff and experiences? When you start to dig in, it's interesting, right? You start to dig in on a person's motivations, and what would be very natural for many of us is to start to feel a little uncomfortable with this kind of digging that somebody's doing, especially if it's in a public setting. Think about Socrates there, right? It's going to be a little uncomfortable. And two, it's going to be a little uncertain, and that's going to add to the discomfort, right? And it's uncertain maybe because we've never really, if we're honest, dug that deeply into our own motivation. Now, so the line of questioning there often sort of stalls in uncertainty. Sometimes it stalls prior to that. It stalls earlier around the question of, well, I'm trying to get my degree. And I might say, well, why are you trying to get a degree? And some person might say, because I'm going to be the first person in my family to get it, and my family really wants me to do this, right? And I think that's a powerful, powerful answer. If you're the part of a generation that takes your family to this sort of next level in terms of educational accomplishment, I just want to give you props on that. On the other hand, it's a kind of an interestingly honest answer that would also maybe make somebody feel a little uncomfortable, because if we boil it down, at one point you're saying, at one level you're saying, I'm doing all this because it is expected of me. And that's, again, for many of us, just kind of honest, right? Like, well, why are you doing this? Why are you pursuing a job and, this, stuff and experiences? And maybe another possible answer is, well, because that's what everybody else is doing. And again, I don't mean everybody else to sound judgy and say this has got to be everybody's path, right? But there is a pattern here that maybe we can see. A lot of people sort of unfold it in this way or in a similar way, whether it involves college or not. It often involves, a job and attempt to, establish some kind of stability and security, which, unfortunately in 21st century, late stage capitalism is getting harder and harder to come by. But let's set that complexity aside for a second and just say that one of the honest places we arrive at by digging deeper, sort of digging back, this regress, digging back into the motivation of the person deeper and deeper, is we often find that there is a kind of, I don't know, get off my back, dude, quit asking. I was like, well, you volunteered, kind of thing. Or, well, my family or my community expects this of me, or I don't know, everybody's doing it. And I think those are honest answers, but also when we say them out loud, right, like they're not very satisfying answers. Not to me. They shouldn't be satisfying, to the individual giving them, right? Like to realize, I would think it's almost a Socratic moment, a kind of a turning away from the shadows moment. Why are you doing this? Well, I don't know why I'm doing it. Yeah, all this effort, I don't know why I'm doing it. I mean, that's, by the way, very natural to have that kind of experience, and it might induce what we think of as a little kind of mini existential crisis. I'm going to come back to that term later in the lecture series, but I think that's kind of honest and important. It doesn't mean you're wrong or you're bad or you're insufficient. It's just honest, right? And that's what maybe so many people who had faced Socrates were led to something like that experience. And it's uncomfortable. But it's also important because then it sets you up for, what? Now let me think about why I'm doing this. Okay, so one of the ways in which this regress is not infinite, how we do find some sort of final answers, is when people say, well, look, I'm trying to get the degree and the job and to get the money, to get the experiences and the stuff. Why? Well, some people say, well, because I would enjoy that. And then you say, well, why would you enjoy that? And or maybe, why do you want enjoyment? And that's where they give you this really weird look, like you're lecturing on ethics and you're asking me why I want enjoyment. I mean, that's a little scary, dude. And you say, well, okay, just go ahead and try to answer the question. And what often happens is they say, well, I don't want my life to suck. I don't want a bunch of discomfort and unhappiness, and, I don't want a lack of enjoyment. Okay, notice what's happened here. You're starting to get to an answer that you can only sort of flip on itself. Why do you want to be happy? I don't want to be unhappy. Go double negative and just sort of flip the answer around and give the same answer. And in some sense, what this line of questioning maybe is showing us, even though I'm going to ultimately be suspicious about ultimate purposes, I do think there's something interesting here to consider. And that is that if you don't know the answer that ends this line of questioning, in some sense, Aristotle's got a point. You don't know really why you're getting out of bed in the morning then. And so the way Aristotle talks about this at the species level, and I've kind of flipped this into the individual, purpose of a life question that I said I wanted to avoid, but I think it kind of helps us to connect to the ideas in at least that moment in lecture. If we bring it back out, Aristotle's saying, look, if we don't find what is at least a reasonable, reasoned out, thoughtful answer based in our observations of ourselves about what is the purpose of human existence, then, we'd have to confront the possibility that everything humans do is ultimately meaningless. Okay. I think we will have to confront that, but it'll take a little bit more intellectual history to unfold before we confront that. For Aristotle, in some sense, this short little passage that's referred to as the argument against infinite regress, is just saying, well, and of course, meaninglessness in all we do is ridiculous, so let's search for the answer. Okay, I'm giving you kind of another 21st century twist on this. That's the way he argues for his question of the Nicomachean Ethics of what is the telos of human life, what is the ultimate purpose of human existence for our kind of the kind of creature we are. I've also sort of hijacked that and pulled something that I think is still kind of interesting out of that line of reasoning. And that is that if we as individuals haven't thought deeply, if we're living unexamined lives in this way, this is a very sort of concrete way to see in what sense is it even your life. You might be playing out the conditioning and programming of family and culture. And if we underline family, which I think really is too narrow in terms of the influences on our existences, but if we just, say, oh, I have a loving family and I want to fulfill their expectations, okay, fine. But consider the possibility that what the last generation thought in a moment of J-curve technological, demographic, and environmental change, maybe what the last generation valued, maybe it's human, maybe it's wisdom, and maybe some of it is outdated. And how will we know if we don't live examined lives, if we don't become philosophically awakened in this way and pursue our own answers to lines of question like this? Okay, so in these two ways, Aristotle argues for the question that in some ways identifies the project of the Nicomachean Ethics, and that is the attempt to find a well-reasoned answer to the very difficult question of what is the purpose of human existence. And without a kind of pretending to have a book of answers and an ultimate truth, Aristotle will, like a scientist, again, very much part of the legacy, I would say, of Aristotelian naturalism, like the scientist will do in the modern age. She will not ever claim, if she's on her game, to have sort of the end-all be-all answer. Evolutionary biology is just a theory, so is gravity, right? But some of these theories are really good because they explain in a very reasonable way so much of the data. And in life, that is, in many ways, the best we can hope for. So Aristotle says, let's go for it. Let's try to find the answer that will inform an understanding of the purpose of our human lives. And so, maybe you are convinced by Aristotle that this is an important question. Maybe you started off, convinced, and all this time you're like, okay, let's just get to it. And Aristotle is kind of in some ways a little painfully methodical. And so he says, wait, we're not ready for this yet. Before we look for a good answer, we should do a little thinking about what a good answer would look like. Okay, all right, Aristotle, fair enough. Here's the reasoning. I mean, this is the way I think about it. Tell me this has not happened to you. Have you ever been looking for something in your home and realized you forgot what you're looking for? That's not just me, right? And so the question is, well, what do you do in that moment? And I ask my students this, and they often give me these very reasonable answers, like, well, I retrace my steps and try to figure out, what I was looking for. And I say, well, that's really good. I'm afraid to admit, I'm embarrassed to admit a little bit that sometimes what I'll do, honestly, is I will keep looking for a little bit, at least. I will look around because if I'm in the right room, at least, and maybe when I see it, I'll remember it, right? And of course, I laugh at myself, and maybe we can all laugh at ourselves a little bit for doing that, or, especially if we do it too long, because you really don't want to look for something when you don't know what you're looking for. That is about, talk about a fool's errand, right? A quixotic quest, looking for something when you don't know what it is you're looking for. Okay, that to me seems to be the logic here of Aristotle's next very methodical, very systematic move in his unpacking of his theory. He's argued for the question, and now before we go seeking for a decent answer to the question, he wants to do some thinking about what a good answer would look like. And he actually has some pretty interesting points to make about this. He says that whatever this answer is, it ought to have like three qualities at least to it. On the one hand, this thing, whatever it is that we decide is the purpose of human existence, it ought to be self-sufficient. And the way I interpret this is it ought to be by itself sufficient to make life feel meaningful and successful. Whatever else you don't achieve, if you achieve this thing, right, this whatever it is, purpose of human existence, you should feel pretty good about your life. So by itself, it should be sufficient to make life seem worthwhile. So whatever answers this question should be self-sufficient in that way. Secondly, it should be final, and this is kind of this is kind of a almost purely logical point. If we are looking for an ultimate answer, a greatest good, a final purpose, and I said underline that word, we're going to come back to it, then this purpose should be final in the sense that it is sought for the sake of itself. It is not sought for the sake of something further. If it's a greatest or an ultimate, it's sought for itself and not as a means to a further end. And I treat that again as kind of a purely logical point. But let's go ahead and just, talk about an example here that's a little bit useful that showed up in the Greek context, but also shows up, I think, in the 21st century context. And that is the way in which many people, they won't talk like this, but they'll live their lives in such a way that their goal seems to be wealth. And we might say that wealth really is in some sense sort of a form of power. And, is that a good sort of ultimate end? And here's where the points being developed by Aristotle can begin to do a little intellectual work for us. And again, just sort of remind us of something that we probably already knew, but here's where the intellectual work comes in, done by the ideas and the thinking. Is power self-sufficient? Will it sort of guarantee that life feels worthwhile? Probably not, although a lot of people seem to think it will be. Is it final? Is power or wealth as an expression of power final in the sense that it's sought for the sake of itself and not for some further end? And I would say clearly not. If you think wealth and I would argue even power is sought for the sake of itself, then in some sense you've caught the Thrasymacheian bug, right? From my earlier lecture on Plato's Republic. You are so, taken by spirit, as Plato would describe it, so taken by ambition that you're now seeking power as an end in and of itself. And power and wealth as an expression of power is really, when you think about it, only valuable, right, to the extent of what else it allows you to do as a means to further ends. And let's hope ethical ends, right? Of course, that's not always the case. And in fact, this is kind of one of the reasons why I wanted to, and Aristotle very much does this as well, look briefly at wealth and power, which in ancient Greek culture was also apparently something that humans sort of sought after in a way that looked like a form of psychological imbalance and certainly a kind of a getting your priorities about life wrong. That in some sense, what we want to hope is that we are trying to cultivate any wealth and any power and influence and control over our lives so that we can cultivate the good in life, right? And so that's what leads to the question of what is the good, which I'm arguing is sort of the big, deep ethical question, both in terms of how do we get the most out of existence, and also we'll see, and we've made this connection a couple times already in the lecture series, what does it mean to be a good person? What does it mean to do good with wealth and power? So wealth and power are not good answers, even though people often live that way, apparently in ancient Greece, and we certainly see it in our culture today, because they're not self-sufficient, they're not final. And then the third quality that a good answer to this question must have is that it must be attainable. Generally, I would say generally attainable. Now, I want to challenge you here. In some sense, this is probably a kind of an implicit critique of Plato. And you, if you followed this lecture series closely enough, have enough to know why this is an Aristotelian critique of Platonic teaching here. An example of this attitude, there's a quote attributed to Aristotle: "Dear is Plato, but dearer still is truth." Now, whether he said it or not, it seems true to the spirit that informs his philosophy, and that is that he loved Plato and appreciated that relationship and the opportunities afforded him by Plato and the academy, but he was always going to follow the line of argument, and he was always going to follow the data, and he was never going to just stay loyal or true to Plato just to stay loyal or true to Plato, despite the fact, because he loved him. He was going to pursue understanding and wisdom and knowledge and truth. And in this case, we're seeing Aristotle kind of break with Plato on a point about the way in which the good of existence is, as Plato would have said, attainable by only a few. And Aristotle is going to say it's got to be something generally attainable, particularly if it's an answer to the question that's framing the Aristotelian search, right? Which is what is the purpose of human existence? Why would there be a purpose for human existence, assuming that there is one for a second, assuming the teleological framework for a second, that is not generally attainable? Now, I say generally attainable because, as you'll see, Aristotle's not some overly romantic, idealistic, utopian thinker. He's a very sort of grounded thinker in many respects. And he's not saying everybody can attain, the purpose of human existence. No, because you can be too unlucky. You can lack the relationships and lack the opportunities, right? But if you were lucky enough to be the acorn that falls in the right kind of soil, to sort of pull from another teleological reference in Aristotelian writing, if you're the acorn that falls in the right kind of soil and you get what you need in terms of water and sunlight, then you have every opportunity, generally attainable, every opportunity to become the most noble oak tree you can be. And if you are a human child that falls into the right soil in terms of relationships and opportunities, and you work hard and you continue to get some breaks with regard to opportunities and relationships, then you can, and I'll start to use this language, become the kind of fullest expression of a human being. You can actualize your potential as the kind of creature you are. You can learn to flourish as a human being. And of course, we might add, because we're 21st century individualistic thinkers, of course, maybe add your own flavor. I throw this in there because people resist the general language about humanity. I think that's wrong, but okay, add the layer in. You're going to get your own twist on this. You are an individual. Okay, if your life is really, really good, then you're going to find something that's really, really individually meaningful to you. But you're going to build that on top of your human foundation. We share the same biology, right? Despite race, despite class, despite gender, despite biological sex, despite sexual orientation and nationality and language, we are all, it would seem, genetic cousins. We are all Homo sapiens, right? And so we want to build, if we want to get to building individual lives, yes, fair enough. But of course, we're going to build this on the foundation of our shared humanity, right? That's what this tradition of seeking wisdom is really aiming at, right? Okay, so it must be self-sufficient. Whatever answers this question, it must be final. It must be generally attainable. Little shot at Plato, who argued that the greatest good is attainable only by the enlightened few. And here's a moment where you can ask yourself, do you lean more towards the esoteric teachings, the teachings known and understood only by the few, or do you lean more in the Aristotelian direction toward the exoteric teachings, the teachings that are generally available to and understandable by a majority of creatures like us? Okay, so the next move in the argument for Aristotle is to, like a good scientist would do, right? And particularly a good social scientist. You're looking for the purpose of human existence. Don't sit in your chair alone and philosophize about it, right? Go out in the world and watch the humans, talk to the humans and watch the humans to try to get data about human living, right? And so Aristotle does this, and he comes up with kind of a short list of things that it looks like humans are living for, which includes, by the way, power and wealth. Some are living for what he calls sort of a virtue or an excellence just for the sake of excellence. He says that, that's not totally wrong, but there's something that's missing about that. So I'm going to set that concept aside for a second and let it come back in later in the lecture in its right place, according to Aristotle. Some are living for pleasure, and Aristotle says, okay, pleasure. Actually, a whole school of thought is going to be developed on this idea that the goal of life is pleasure. This is called the hedonist school. My next couple of lectures in the series will deal with that. But Aristotle is going to reject pleasure as a meaningful answer to his question, because he feels as if it's just not unique to the human species. And if multiple species can achieve, let's say, sensual pleasure, to kind of simplify it for a second for thought's sake, well, then clearly that can't be why we're here, if multiple species can achieve it. But there's one answer, he says, that sort of meets the test set up by the three criteria of self-sufficient, final, and attainable. There's one answer that shows up over and over again that seems final, seems self-sufficient, seems generally attainable, may be unique to the human being. And this is often in English translations of the Greek work here, the answer given as happiness. Okay, I want to say that I find that common translation of the Greek word eudaimonia or eudaimonia, I find it deeply unsatisfying, and I think I see why in some sense. And again, I can't pretend that I'm some great scholar of Greek. I'm not. So, I'm reliant here on scholars of Greek for my translations. But apparently the roots of this word, the EU, is kind of a goodness, and the daimon part is kind of a spiritedness, and it's a good spiritedness maybe. And so you can see why there's this tendency to translate the word in terms as happiness. But I just would challenge you in any work you do in thinking about Aristotle's theory, Aristotle's ethics, anytime you see the word happiness, be a little suspicious. And we don't need a great thinker like Aristotle to construct a long argument about the goal of human life is happiness. I mean, it's overly simple. And not only is it overly simple, it's really kind of empty, because it raises the next question, which is, and how does one achieve that, right? And secondly, what exactly do we even mean? And thirdly, right, it's cliche, it's simple, and now I've argued it's kind of empty in the sense that, how does one even get happiness? And thirdly, it's kind of empty in another sense, like, what do we even mean by happiness? Because if we mean that the goal of life for many people is thought of as kind of this emotional positivity, there's just all kinds of good reasons to believe that that's just not a realistic goal at all. And so I strongly lean against and sort of advocate against that translation of happiness. I just don't find it helpful. In fact, not only not helpful, I find it maybe takes our minds in the wrong direction. Aristotle's not saying you should always try to be happy. I mean, that's just not, I don't think, the best way to understand Aristotle. And so the word eudaimonia has an alternate translation. It's sometimes unpacked as a kind of a human flourishing. Now, this answer is problematic too. It has some of the same problems. It raises the question of, okay, fine, how do you achieve it? And then secondly, it's a kind of empty, what does that really even mean, to flourish as a human being? Well, The thing that I would say about this translation that is better, and every time you read happiness in some English translation of Aristotle, think about throwing flourishing in there. It really is going to change the meaning, I think, of the passage or the sentence in some interesting and thought-provoking ways. It's not misleading in the sense that it's not connected to some kind of emotional positivity that the word happiness is, and the way the word happiness is. And it also gives us, I think, a more promising direction for thought from this point in the overall Aristotelian argument. Because if we say the goal of human life is human flourishing, that should lead us to the next question, which is, what does it mean to flourish as a human being? Which leads us back, and here's this same move we're seeing all the mature and sophisticated thinkers make. You want to have a theory of a good life? Eventually, at some point, you're going to have a theory of life, and more specifically, a theory of the kind of creature we are. And here's this moment in Aristotle. Want to have a theory of eudaimonia? Want to have a theory of human flourishing? Then you need to have a theory of the human. And so Aristotle's move, again, echoing his teacher, but in important ways different from his teacher, is to unpack a theory of that which animates the human being, a theory of the psyche, life force, soul, perhaps. That which animates us is, again, echoing Plato, not unified. It is complex. And so, know thyself shows up again in a really influential thinker. And know thyself as a complexity rather than a simple unity shows up again in the thinking of a very influential thinker. And here, he's going to not only develop his complexity in a way that Plato does, he's going to develop it specifically as a sort of a three-part complexity in the way that Plato does. And the way later on, maybe Freud will, as I said in my Plato lecture, so there's this tendency to look for the Trinity within the unity. I have to say, I find that a little bit interesting, as sort of a pattern of thought, especially in terms of important ideas that are focused on maybe getting the most out of existence, that there's a kind of a tendency to look for the relationship between the Trinity and the unity. And here it is, in terms of knowing thyself, a very biologically focused, for Aristotle, the down-to-earth naturalist, a biologically focused Trinity, in which he says, we have within us these three layers, and at the most basic level of existence within us that animates us, we have what he calls the vegetative element, and that is the kind of life force that seems present even in plant life, hence the phrase vegetative element here. And that is, for Aristotle in particular, I think there's a lot of strange research into plant communication these days. Plants are very, very cool, organisms that, we don't understand a lot, but I'm going to give you kind of a standard way of understanding some of our key differences. We don't observe in plants, the kind of physiological complex structures that we see in other kinds of animals, complex animals. And so for this reason, we have historically imagined in some sense that what plants do is kind of an automatic, and this is certainly true of Aristotle's observations, an automatic seeking after the nutritional needs of the life form. And in us, this manifests as sort of hunger pains and becoming thirsty, right? And maybe a sexual urge to propagate, that in some sense, that which is involved in keeping the species alive, you don't have to do a lot of thought about this. In fact, it's kind of going to get in the way of a lot of thought sometimes. And this, in the human, kind of echoes or has parallels to what Aristotle's observations of plant life seem to yield, and that is that there is a kind of a seeking after water, and there's a seeking after light, and there's even, it turns out, a kind of exchange of gases going on. I'm not sure that Aristotle would have understood that. But the vegetative element is kind of as Aristotle conceives of it, that part of ourselves that is sort of unconscious, automatic, taking care of the basic needs of the organism. And it includes not only seeking what we need to continue the species and ourselves as an expression of the species, it's also things like the way in which when you're cut, if you don't have some kind of unique genetic disorder, then your blood is going to coagulate into a scab, right, that will close your wound. And you don't have to do this yourself. You can help by putting, pressure on something that's bleeding a lot, but your body has a way to deal with this. And so do plants, we might add, right? So like plants, we are alive in this way. Okay, but unlike plants, Aristotle will argue, and more like other more complex animals, we've got a kind of a physiological complexity that these days we would associate with a nervous system and some kind of place where the information of the nervous system is processed, let's say a brain. And in some kind of organisms, that kind of physiological structure gives rise to what Aristotle calls, unfortunately, the appetitive element, or the impetitive level of the psyche or life force. But here he's really, in some sense, talking about the way in which certain forms of life can feel existence. They have sentience and can respond based on this feeling. Again, I think that there are certain plants that show some interesting signs of this. Maybe what we can say is that Aristotle may be a little bit overly simple in his general categories, or maybe we can be more charitable and say these are just general observations about sort of levels of complexity that we find in the natural world. You got plant life with this vegetative psyche that animates it, and then you've got other animal forms of life that have a vegetative psyche, but also have the appetitive psyche that allow that kind of creature to feel its existence and to kind of react to the feeling of that existence. And this is the notion of sentience. And I'm going to use that word because I think it's really important in ethical discourse, particularly in applied ethical issues like maybe even abortion or something like that. That might be an important concept to consider, how it's relevant and in what ways is it relevant to, the debates over when it's morally permissible to terminate forms of life. Because, it's not enough to say, you just can't terminate life. Like that idea that thou shalt not kill is, of course, way overly simple, right? I mean, we kill all the time. The ethical debate based on that principle of thou shalt not kill is, what do you mean by that? What kind of killing is wrong and what kind of killing is allowable? And I think in some respects, sentience very much obviously figures into what we're doing. Most of us don't feel at all bad about sort of chopping down a weed in our yard, if we have a yard, right? Or maybe picking off a part of a flower bush or a vegetable bush, exactly because we don't think in some sense that plant is suffering, because we think that plant doesn't have sentience. Now, again, we can't say for sure, but in terms of physiological structures that I've referenced, like nervous systems and brains, there's some reason for concluding that this is what makes the dog yelp and jump away, and why maybe the plant doesn't. I mean, again, that may be overly simple, but I think I'm trying to build a charitable case for how Aristotle would have arrived at these conclusions, right? And in some respects, they're very intuitive based on the observations that would have been available, and even based on many of the observations of the world we make today. And so, when we chop down a tree, we don't feel moral guilt about that. But if you were to chop, a sentient being, a creature with what Aristotle would call an appetitive psyche, well, now you got a moral issue on your hands, right? And, what's the difference there? Well, Aristotle would say it's the levels of complexity in the physiological structures, and hence the type, that which animates, the psyche that animates that kind of creature. If it's appetitive, that's another kind of level of existence. But remember, all this we're doing to build a theory of us. And Aristotle's saying that, look, we have the appetitive psyche, we have the appetitive and the vegetative elements of the psyche. But we also have something that looks to be based on human conduct and behavior and introspection, something that is, Aristotle, I imagine, would have said, completely unique to our kind, and that is what he calls the rational element of the psyche. Now, again, let's be charitable to Aristotle. It's kind of an interesting observation to make. His data set was so much narrower than ours that he really did not have a sense for the kind of evolutionary ancestors that have existed on the planet that would make the continuum of these sort of structures of life much more sort of just that, a spectrum. He's got it sort of chopped up into these neat, categories of the vegetative, the appetitive, and now humans as the only rational. I think in many ways that is worthy of critique from a 21st century perspective. But to be charitable to Aristotle, not only in terms of how he arrived at that conclusion, but also in terms of what work he wants to do with this part of his argument, he's going to say that this is okay, even if he could say this is not completely unique to us, maybe we could say it like this. This is a part of the human game. When I say this, the rational psyche, that which animates us in terms of our ability for cognition, abstract thought, logic, language in terms of complex symbol use and manipulation. This is our game in a way that it just doesn't appear to be many other creatures' games, right? It's why you and I are participating in a lecture on the meaning of existence and ethics, and why squirrels are not, even though they're incredible climbers, right? And more I'm thinking they're very, very brave and very, very bold. I used to think that they were just kind of, frivolous and silly and maybe not that, smart. I now think they're actually just really, really bold to the point of they've kind of got like a little squirrel culture where they like to show off in terms of how close to a dog they can get and how close to a car they can get. Again, I'm half joking here, but my point is this: squirrels can climb amazingly. Birds, many of them fly amazingly. Cheetahs are fast. But let's give Aristotle his point. Humans think. And now, again, we didn't need the great Aristotle to tell us that. It's already been a part of the lecture series so far, and it was probably already something that you thought about yourself. But in terms of the way he's building his ideas, this is a very systematic and methodical approach to trying to figure out a decent answer to his question of the purpose of human existence. He's now analyzed the psyche, the life force of the human. He's turned towards reality, this part of reality that is us. He's doing his metaphysics here. We might say provocatively, he's doing his psychology here, or his biology of us. And he has found that which is, if not totally unique to us, very unique to us in some respects. I don't know if that phrase really works, but it's certainly our game in a way that it is not most other species' games. Cheetahs are fast, humans use abstract thought. So how's this important? Well, if you want to figure out what it means to flourish, remember this language, as the kind of creature you are, and you're putting this into the context of a teleological search for the telos or purpose of human existence, then finding what is unique to us, or at least sort of largely unique to us, is an important clue. That's an important bit of data, right? And so it's going to allow Aristotle to start to build out his proposed definition of eudaimonia, or human flourishing, as the purpose of human existence. And if anywhere along the way you say, I just don't buy it, Aristotle, how can you purport to know? Well, again, this is not him claiming to have revelatory insight, that you don't have access to all the same data and all the same capacities for reasoning. Just point out where in his argument he's going wrong and modify his conclusion accordingly, right? Because remember, and this is why I sort of did this when I talked about the argument from infinite regress, in some sense, this remains one of the compelling questions of human existence. And I phrased it in the lecture series as, what is, a good human life? What does a good human life sort of aim at? But let me phrase it in a slightly different way, playing on the lecture today. What are you getting out of bed for in the morning? What's your best answer? So go ahead and stand on the shoulders of giants here. Don't try to reinvent the wheel. And, part of that might mean totally disagreeing with or disagreeing with major elements of thinkers who you have to admit, even if they are, some, hand-picked group of, men of money with a certain ethnicity, some subset of humanity, these were humans too. And they were putting some effort into this, right? And if we're honest, they put a lot more effort into this and stood more directly on the shoulders of many giants than you and I have, right? And so with some humility, perhaps we should have some gratitude for, frankly, just the opportunity to stand on the shoulders of these giants. And that might mean, going through their reasoning and figuring out what we disagree with. But as we do that, we are cultivating a more sophisticated and nuanced answer for ourselves as to why we're getting out of bed in the morning, right? And in this sense, maybe as humans contributing to the ongoing evolution of socially constructed reality, to pull that definition of philosophy back out of my first lecture in the series. And so Aristotle starts to build here his definition of eudaimonia. And he builds it as the activity of the rational aspect of the psyche. That's the starting place here, based on this data and reasoning that he's generated so far in his theory of the psyche, the tripartite, his version of the tripartite theory of the psyche. Now, but very quickly, he's going to have to point out, look, it's not enough to have, let's call it a mind and have it turned on. You are not flourishing as a human being if you have a mind and you have it turned on. In fact, those of you who've looked at my lecture on Taoism, you will know that in some sense, as Homo sapiens, we all have a mind, and it's very much turned on practically all the time. And so much so that it's kind of like a powerful tool, like a jackhammer, that instead of doing what it could for us, it's left on all the time. It's not only not helping, it's in some ways a liability. To have a mind that's simply active, or as many of you often describe for me, you admit, and I can relate, especially I have a long day of thinking and lecturing and reading. I'm so in my head, right, that I have this kind of overactive mind spin going on that it's sort of constantly interrupting my ability to participate in other modes of existence. So we need to hasten to add, as Aristotle does, that human flourishing is not just activity of the mind or activity of the rational aspect of these certain cognitive abilities. It is developing these cognitive abilities, this rational aspect, towards virtue. Now, here's where this important ancient concept comes back into the picture in a meaningful way, I think, in Aristotelian Ethics. And here I just want to use it somewhat simply as a synonym for excellence. And we'll unpack it a little bit more as we go forward. But we need to develop our rational aspect towards excellence. And then he adds another layer of the definition, over a lifetime. Now, that little phrase, over a lifetime, should be a little intriguing if you think about it at all. How does Aristotle know how long we're going to live? How can we develop enough excellence in order to flourish if our lives are kind of tragically short? How excellent do we have to get in order to flourish as human beings? How much time do we need? Is this part of that generally attainable if you got a full life? Well, look, I think actually maybe in some sense there's a truth to this. If you tragically, die in early childhood, there's some sense in which very obviously some of your uniquely human capabilities have gone unexpressed and undeveloped. You just didn't have the time to do it. And that's part of the tragedy of early death. So yeah, in some sense, it's going to require a certain amount of living. But in another sense, I think there's something more subtle going on. It's another break from Plato here. And that is that Aristotle, in some sense, is going to break from the Platonic notion of a level 4 sort of finish line experience that represents the heights of human experience. And in some sense, what I think he's leaning towards is, to use the cliche, the journey is the destination. That flourishing is not about a certain level of excellence that has to be attained. It's about a certain direction in which one is continuously actualizing your uniquely human potentials. And let me underline something here, because even if we end up, as we will, critiquing some of the whole of the teleological framework for these ideas, there's something really reasonable here that's going to be echoed in, let's say, refined hedonist philosophy, and even in much of 20th century psychology, I would say. And that is that satisfaction with existence, that notion of self-sufficiency, is deeply tied to sort of developing one's self-capability, not only as an individual, which we're very common in the way we reach for that direction of thought, but as the kind of creature you are, as a human being. So I think there is some wisdom to be found here, and it often is going to show up in the late modern age in the form of positive psychologies. Think of maybe Maslow's hierarchy or something like that, or Rogerian psychology, the psychologies of what it means to sort of not only not be struggling with certain forms of mental illness or emotional disabilities or limitations or fears or anxiety, which all of us to some degree or another probably struggling with, some raising to the level of sort of diagnosis, some not. But not only do we go beyond that, to what sense do we have a vision for our lives as to why we're moving away from these limitations that confront us all, toward what? Toward what positive vision of existence? And I'm just giving you kind of a commonsensical, right? I mean, in some ways, Aristotle is very commonsensical vision that, as a human, yeah, you're an individual, but as a human, there are just some uniquely or, especially human capabilities that if you were to cultivate them, not to some finish line level, but if you were to simply work on actualizing these human potentials, then there would be this sort of self-sufficiency achieved, this kind of this felt meaningfulness of our weekly, monthly, daily, even year-to-year lives. It would just tend to be not a happy existence, maybe something we could turn away from that concept of happiness, as I recommended earlier, maybe towards something deeper, that there would be a kind of a contentment or maybe a joy that transcends both the poles of happiness and sadness and pain in our lives, but a kind of a deep-rooted satisfaction with our existence. And I think Aristotle, in many ways, part of the strength of his project here is this just sort of sets the stage for, yeah, absolutely. Psychology itself is going to sort of build on this notion of actualize your uniquely human potential or your especially human potentials, and life satisfaction is going to be more likely, not guaranteed. And so what is he doing? He's building his vision of human flourishing, activity of the rational aspect of the soul in accordance with virtue, sort of in agreement with excellence, towards excellence, over a lifetime, right? In a life that is actively lived. Let's dwell on that, actively lived. My interpretation of that is that he's saying, look, this is not a life of the mind that retreats from the projects of existence. It doesn't retreat from society. It doesn't retreat from relationships. It doesn't hide in ideas. It's not, to use a kind of an overly simple idea, bookwormish in that respect, right? Like flourishing is to take this capacity for continuously unpacking especially human cognitive potentialities related to what he calls the rational aspect, and use those in an engaged way in community and in relationships and in projects of living. And then lastly, he adds, to this definition, with the presence of some external goods. So the definition as we built it out is human flourishing, or as he has proposed it in this great project, this great work, the Nicomachean Ethics, human flourishing is activity of the rational aspect in accordance with virtue over a lifetime that is actively lived and has the presence of some external goods. Now, this last little element is a kind of a surprising and almost jarring element when you read it in the Nicomachean Ethics, because so much of what he's done so far is to say how you could flourish by doing and by choosing, right, what to do in your life and actualizing this ability. And here what he's going to say, quite literally in certain portions of the passages related to the external goods, is, and let's just hope that you have some decent friends and some decent family, and let's just hope that you are fortunate enough in your relationships and your opportunities. You got a little bit of money, you got a little bit of influence, you got some friends around you and family around you that care about you. Let's hope, and it gets a little dark here, you don't lose too many good people in your life. Let's hope you have maybe good children and that you don't lose your good children in life. Again, a little jarring, that flourishing somehow would refer to something so sort of seemingly out of your control. And even at one point he says, and let's hope you've got some kind of modicum, some basic amount of good looks, of beauty, because it's very hard, I think, a paraphrase here, to do something very noble in existence, to have a really kind of great existence if you're too ugly to look at. Again, that's one of those moments where it's like, what? Is this Aristotle, the classicist, sexist, racist, now sort of saying, and the beautiful people are more likely to flourish? What do we make of that? The people in life that haven't had a lot of loss are more likely to flourish. Okay, that's where maybe you can see how you'd want to be charitable. If you ever think something like, well, Aristotle's just an idiot. Okay, you may want to rethink that kind of attitude. Does he make mistakes? Of course, he does make mistakes, and maybe it is one. But be careful about being too dismissive of some of these great thinkers, because just that they are really impressive thinkers in so many ways. They're probably not just being total fools about something. Is there any reality to the fact that you can be too unlucky in life through loss and grief and hardship and suffering and lack of opportunities and lack of a community, a philia, Sophia that would bring out the best in you? In some sense, yes, right? In some sense, external goods matter. And of course, Aristotle is saying your choices matter. And we're going to finish with that here in a second, but he's also, I think, maybe trying to be a little bit more down to earth and less sort of utopian and idealistic and overly romantic about it, and just, anybody can do anything. It can be pretty hard depending on your life experiences, And now, with that said, I think that the interesting pushback available here is, sometimes it's the hardships of existence that cause us to make the best lemonade, right? If I can mix my metaphors there a little bit. Sometimes it's the lemons, right, that leads to the lemonade. Sometimes it's the trauma. Sometimes it's the setbacks. Sometimes it's what we struggled with the most, and overcoming that really leads to our flourishing. So, of course, give this some more thought. Maybe it's too many easy opportunities that lead to us to not develop ourselves to our full potential. Whatever you decide about this element of Aristotelian philosophy, the goal here ultimately is, push on it if you want, resist it if you want, develop your thinking as to why you resist it, and what does that say about your own more sophisticated, more nuanced philosophy of a good existence now that you've wrestled with this giant. Or, alternatively, pull on aspects of the theory, pull on them, right? Pull them to you in the sense of sort of decide what you agree with and why you agree with it as you build your notions of a good life as well. Because ultimately, this is all about helping all of us to become more sophisticated and nuanced thinkers about existence today, because we're confronted with the same old questions of why get out of bed in the morning, and how should we be good people, and how are we going to do all this together going forward in this moment. Those are still huge, huge, daunting questions, but burying your head in the sand is probably not the way we're gonna solve those. Well, definitely not the way we're going to solve those questions. Okay, so I want to finish up here what is already a very long and very complex lecture on this super influential and sophisticated thinker, Aristotle, by pulling out of that definition the word virtue and fleshing it out a little bit more in the way that Aristotle does. So excellence in terms of the development of the rational aspect can go one of two directions, according to Aristotle. It would be intellectual excellence, intellectual virtue, and moral virtue. And generally speaking, I'm going to try to just sketch these for you at the end of my lecture today. Intellectual virtue is about, learning how to think well and learning how to learn and loving to learn and becoming kind of an educated person, whether that's in a formal setting or not. Intellectual excellence for Aristotle is the life of the philosopher. And again, not narrowly conceived as doing what academic philosophers do in the 21st century, but broadly conceived from the ancient period as the person who is awake to the questions of existence and actively seeks them and actively seeks out the skills, to know, what are the sources of data that are reliable and what are the processes of mind that help me to deal with that data in such a way that it will yield meaningful results to me. This is what the person of intellectual virtue is pursuing over the course of his or her whole life, right? But there's also the direction of excellence that Aristotle calls moral virtue, which is going to seem much more relevant, right, as we explore ethics. Intellectual virtue is huge for Aristotle. Being philosophically awakened is a huge part of trying to have a good life for Aristotle. But of course, let's not neglect, moral virtue or moral excellence is the way in which we develop excellence in the life of the mind as it relates to our conduct and our choices. And so he presents us with kind of a vision of moral virtue, which is the aim here is to cultivate a kind of an excellence, not only in our choosing, but ultimately in what he calls our character, that tends to make certain kinds of choices in life. And I'm going to give you kind of a general version of this and then finish with a more specific version of this that leads to the very famous doctrine of the mean to conclude the lecture on Aristotle. So the general version of it is this, that what you have to do with your mind over your lifetime is not avoid mistakes, but avoid making the same mistakes over and over again. A crucial way to develop excellence in the life of the mind for a human being is to use your capacity for abstract thought, memory and reflection and imagination and how certain experiences allow you to interpret what's happening in this moment and what might happen in the near future or in long-term future in order to avoid making the kinds of mistakes you've already made. It is not a problem for Aristotle to make mistakes. Perfection is not a part of the Aristotelian model. It is very hard in life, he says, to hit the mark in terms of choices. And really, perfection is not the goal. But the goal, right, is unpacking your potential over the course of while you're alive, which means to get better and better at learning from the errors you have made. There's a friend of mine, as a poet, developed this image that I thought was pretty neat and applies in this moment. He said that life is about sort of walking down a dark hall. And the only way you can really know every once in a while that you are actually going down this long, dark path is that you occasionally have to bump into the walls. Bumping the walls is not the problem, but bumping the wall over and over again in the same place in the same way, that is the problem, right? And so moral virtue or moral excellence is the utilization of your rational aspect to get better at making your choices and ultimately to cultivate in yourself a kind of a habit of being, which he calls character, in which you tend towards certain kinds of choices that are more or less taking you forward in terms of your progress, and they're minimizing the speed at which you hit the wall. Very normal to hit the wall pretty hard when you're young. Let's hope that over the course of your lifetime, you get a little more well, a little less likely to hit the walls in the same way. Of course, life is a moving target. I think Aristotle, in his way, recognizes this. This is partly why he's not gonna offer us, hey, do this, don't do this. That's too simple, and Aristotle recognizes it. In fact, in the beginning of the Nicomachean Ethics, he has a line that roughly like, look, I'm writing a book on ethics here. This is not geometry. This is not mathematics. And you should not expect the kind of precise answers in a book on ethics that you might get in a book on geometry or mathematics, okay? We can't just give each other wisdom in the form of do this, don't do that, here are the rules for good living. Life is a moving target. So the best we can hope for is to get better and better, to develop greater and greater levels of moral excellence, better and better at making choices, which then feed into habits, which then feed into this more permanent, not permanent, but more permanent structure called character. Which if we, update this slightly, we say, well, of course, part of this is tied to your genetics and part of this is tied to your upbringing. That in part determines the character and the kinds of choices you tend towards. But once you become a self-aware, particularly self-aware kind of adult human being, then you can no longer simply say, well, that's unfortunately just the way I was born, or that's just how I was raised, and then just keep hitting the wall the same way over and over again. In some sense, Aristotle said you'd be letting yourself off the hook too easily, right? Like this is one of the real gems of an observation, I feel like, in Aristotelian virtue ethics that says, you want to cultivate a kind of a character that inclines you towards certain kinds of choices that get you moving forward and keep you roughly moving forward in life. But please notice that your goal here is to build your character. And even though you've inherited maybe from your genetics and your upbringing certain tendencies that we might associate with your character, you are not set in stone to such a degree that you can't build yourself over time by learning to make different choices. Maybe I come out of a family that's got addictive behaviors, okay, and maybe that gives me a higher chance of being an addict. I think that's really realistic in many respects, right? If that's what I've seen, it's very understandable if that's what I become. On the other hand, maybe I'll emotionally react against that and kind of go and hit the other wall and just be really, really anxious about all kinds of indulgences in life. And so that I'd sort of miss out on a lot of life based on anxiety and fear, reacting emotionally against, where I've come from. But in either case, I would be giving up something of this somewhat mysterious agency that I seem to have in my existence. And let's set aside the deeper philosophical question that looms metaphysically in the background about agency and free will for a moment. Let's go on with the assumption that, while I am strongly determined by genetics and by my upbringing and by my nurture, it sure feels as if I do have some choice here. And maybe I can find a way to avoid fear, right, and anxieties. And I can also find a way to avoid excessive indulgences in certain things that have obviously proved detrimental to me and people in my family. And so the choices Aristotle will describe, the choices you want to try to build towards, are what we might call the moderate choices, the virtuous choices, the choices lying in a mean. And every day of existence, just keep in mind that you are either building yourself through the choices you're making towards who you want to be, or you're building yourself away from who you want to be. If who you want to be, let's say, is more sort of present to your physical form, it doesn't mean running a marathon. Maybe you just want to sort of be more comfortable in your own body. Well, what are the practices, what are the choices that you're making day in, day out, or at least regularly, that are helping you to inhabit your physical form, that are adding to your awareness of your physical form so that you can inhabit it more fully and maybe in a more healthy way? Well, every day you do something, put a chip in that pile of that choice is contributing to a habit, which ultimately will become a part of your character. But every day you don't, you might call it, well, just a rest day. Okay, there are rest days, I get it. But just remember that you're also building that chip pile as well. Those choices to not do it are also contributing to a habit that could also contribute to a character. And the question is, where are you going to be 10 years from now? This, I think, is very powerful. Aristotle's Ethics, in many respects, sort of put it squarely. Yeah, he talks about external goods, but he puts it squarely back in our court. What are you doing to make yourself better and to move yourself towards the best of human existence? And to complete this line of thought, we get to the very, very famous doctrine of the mean, where Aristotle says you want to tend towards choices that are lying in a mean that is determined by reason. And so I'm going to sketch this for you and perhaps expand it a little bit in my review in the next lecture. But the idea here is that Aristotle believes that most good choices, excellent choices, virtuous choices that would contribute to virtuous habits and ultimately towards the virtuous character that we want to build as a part of moral virtue in our lives and as a part of flourishing, that most virtuous or excellent choices are choices that are in kind of a middle ground, he calls it a mean, between two extremes, too much of a certain trait and too little of a certain trait. Consider an easy example pulled right from the Aristotelian literature, the virtuous choices of being courageous in a moment and developing courage in yourself. Aristotle says this isn't, fearlessness, right? Echoing Plato in that regard. Courage is not to be mistaken with foolishness, right? If there is, sort of too little regard for fear, that becomes rashness, that becomes foolhardiness, that is a form of foolishness. It's an extreme and it is a vice, right? Virtues are the things that you want to cultivate because they're going to lead you towards success. In this sense, the vision of success in Aristotelian virtue ethics is flourishing. But vices are the opposite of virtue. They are those habits or traits which unfortunately we can develop in ourselves as well that make our success less likely. In this case, our flourishing less likely. And Aristotle would list among those rashness or foolhardiness, right? Get you killed, get you maimed, get you in trouble, right? But on the other hand, if you are too overly determined by fear, then you are cowardly, right? And you're never going to take on anything, and you're never going to get in your comfort. You're never going to get out of your comfort zone. And if you don't get out of your comfort zone, you never grow. There's a right amount of sort of leaning beyond your comfort zone into a constructive amount of discomfort. Not so much that it overwhelms you and crushes you, but so much that you are forced to grow. And that, in some sense, is this middle ground of courage for Aristotle. And he thinks that every sort of valuable choice can be analyzed in this way. And I would encourage you to think about whether or not you agree with him in his analysis of virtuous choosing. And you might say, well, aren't there obvious examples here? Is there a right amount of adultery? Well, look, certain words are already ethically laden, right, with evaluative content or denotation. And adultery is already kind of laden with a kind of a negative ethical denotation or connotation. And I would say that, in some sense, that question's a little unfair and uncharitable to the doctrine, the way it's phrased. We might rephrase and say, is there a right amount of relating to other people outside of what might be your primary relationship with a significant other? Is there too much and is there too little? And I would say, okay, now that starts to make, right, a little bit more sense. If you disappear into a relationship and you lose all other relationships, that can be problematic for a number of reasons. If, on the other hand, you invest too much energy in other relationships and not enough in your primary relationship, then your primary relationship just dissolves over time. I think that's actually something that happens to a lot of people, especially if they take on projects like children. They just think life is very busy and they just neglect sort of the right amount of date nights or conversations or checking in, or all the different versions of the things that contribute to kind of a healthy level of intimacy in a particular relationship. And so in this way, Aristotle says, look, this is the best I can give you. I can't tell you how to have a good life by telling you always do this and always do that. In fact, it's even more subtle than this. You need to try to get better at finding the middle ground, the mean, over the course of your lifetime, and you're going to do that by hitting extremes. And if you know thyself, you're going to know what your extremes are. For example, I tend to be very social. I tend to historically kind of be invested in a lot of different relationships. Maybe at times that's caused me, if I'm really honest, to maybe not invest the energy I should in certain primary relationships. Maybe at times it's caused me to not invest maybe in sort of knowing myself. I've been too distracted by my relationships with other people as a kind of a natural extrovert. And so now I need to know thyself and correct for my tendency to run into that wall and try to find the more virtuous choice, creating the more virtuous set of habits and cultivating over time a more excellent character as a part of my overall attempt to flourish. Now, Aristotle, I'll finish with this, says that virtuous mean is a moving target. It's not perfection we seek, and in part it's a moving target because it's objective and it's subjective. And I think what he means by that is that there are always good reasons to be sought for and against certain kinds of choices. And if you doubt your ability to generate kind of good reflection and good reasoning about certain kinds of choices, then you should probably talk to the people that you respect the most, people of practical wisdom, people that seem to exhibit this excellence called moral virtue, and try to get their more objective feedback on you and your situation. But there you go. There's the subjective element. This does not mean every individual just does whatever he or she wants to do, right? There's an objectivity to this. It's not as simple as you always need to do this kind of thing. It's more like there are some good reasons for some choices being sort of more reasonable than other choices, less extreme in certain situations. Maybe some situations actually will call for more extreme situations, and you need to think through why that might not be the case, hence the objectivity. But remember, I've mentioned now several times, this is about a particular person's choice in a particular situation. And so you need to take into account the subject, the person, and the context, the situation. And so I like to say that part of the nuance of the famous doctrine of the mean is that it is both sort of rational, determined by good reasons, and objective in this way, not completely, whatever you want to do or what your tradition tells you to do. You look for good reasons as best you can in community with other people you respect for what would be a good reasonable choice in a certain situation. But keep in mind that this is know thyself, this is you, this is not somebody else, and this is a particular situation. Is there a right amount of helpfulness? Well, helping is generally kind of a nice thing to do for people, but are there times, when somebody is taking advantage of you, and you are tired and you have a lot of other very important things to do, and yet thyself, you have trouble saying no, you often want to help, right? Is there good reason now for you to see that you need to push back from the extreme of always saying yes and always helping to saying something that's going to be a little uncomfortable, but it's going to be more close to the mean, right? And say, no, I can't help you right now. You'd be nice about it, right? But no, I can't help you. Part of the reason why is, you maybe never really seem to appreciate that help. And secondly, I've got all these other things going on. I hope you can understand. Even if you don't, I've got this project going on, and that is me trying to make the best self I can. And it's overly simple to imagine that the best self is always giving up the self no matter the circumstance, giving up the self no matter the circumstance, right? Aristotle's teaching is in this respect, I would say, way ahead of its time. I think that the doctrine of the mean is a gem worth wrestling with. And it is the sort of practical edge of this larger, super systematically developed vision of human flourishing that I've laid out for you today. And if you've survived getting through this, lecture, you have certainly, I think, enhanced your intellectual virtue, right? Because just concentration on a line of thought like this is a real challenge. But I wish you flourishing, and that completes my lecture on Aristotelian ethics. I wish you well.